I'm the Master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, and I was the Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service of the United Kingdom up until late 2004. I think you've all heard an awful lot about policy solutions to this vexed and difficult problem, and I'm certainly not going to say anything more really about policy. I have the luxury really of having been the intelligence officer, not a policy maker, and maybe I can dispense a little cold water about this issue. I agree with most of the policy prescriptions that have been proffered here, but I think the problem that we face is one of implementation and actually making policies work. And the frustration we face is not having the instruments, as it were, to impose the decisions that are recommended from this area. I thought that what I would have to say would offend perhaps Dr. Khan, but I am almost 100% in agreement with what he has said. And I would urge focus on very basic issues of reform and institution building in a part of the world where government is completely ineffective, where there is virtually no institutions of civic life, and where the things that we decide to do or would like to do just cannot be implemented and cannot be achieved. I would like to make some particularly practical comments about the difficulty that I encountered dealing with the Pakistani military and with the ISI in particular. I wouldn't make a great distinction between the two organizations. The ISI is always staffed by senior military figures from Pakistan, and generally the head of the ISI is one of the corps commanders. Mark Lyle Grant, I think, mentioned something which is incredibly important and shouldn't be underestimated. These two bits of the Pakistani establishment, which are amongst the most efficient in Pakistan, define themselves by, as it were, Pakistani security in relation to India. And it is quite impossible to have a dialogue with the ISI without India being in the forefront of that dialogue. And my own belief, based on a fair amount of evidence, is that the leadership of the ISI have, as it were, exploited the situation in the FATA areas, as it were, to manipulate their view of Pakistani security in relation to India. And I see a more sort of fundamental problem lying behind the policy descriptions that have been put forward, which I think Mark Lyle Grant stated extremely well, which is trying to change the focus of the Pakistani military and the intelligence service towards a larger perception of international security than, as it were, the generic mistrust and opposition that exists between India and Pakistan. The other thing I think which is really fundamentally surprising about this relationship between India and Pakistan is the poor understanding that the Pakistanis have of Indian capability and security, and the poor understanding that the Indians have of Pakistan. And I would go as far as to say that their intelligence coverage of each other is rather primitive, rather basic, and rather prejudiced. And I think until one sees a sort of reorientation of thinking, particularly on the part of the ISI with regard to India, and probably also some progress on negotiations over Kashmir, which hasn't been mentioned, it is going to be difficult to shift the situation in the FATA territories into, as it were, the perception that we have of looking for a solution. And I think hugely important is starting with some very basic and simple building blocks to try to constitute reform and improve the security situation on the ground. And this is very simple, basic, straightforward stuff. And without it, it is very unlikely that there will be, as it were, progress on the policy issues that have been discussed around this table. I think there is an important lesson here that can be derived from what's happened in Iraq, which I think is extremely interesting. One of the, I think, significant failures in Iraq, to which both we and the Americans were party, was the inability in the early stages after the military conflict to devote sufficient resources on the ground to training and developing Iraqi military and security and civic capability. Now, this was massively discussed at the time, but there was no implementation, or the implementation was so ineffective as to be inconsequential. And I think the situation only began to change on the ground in Iraq when high-quality, well-resourced initiatives were developed, both locally and more broadly across the country, to start to develop the institutions that were required to move Iraq back towards a more normal functioning civic society. And I think that the problems that we face in the FATA area are profoundly challenging because of the need to implement on the ground those types of initiatives and to sustain them over a very, very long period of time. And it's that ability to focus and sustain our involvement which I must say at the moment makes me feel rather pessimistic. I'm very pleased to hear Dr. Khan. I'm not going to go into the history of the area, but I mean, I think this criticism of his own government in terms of both of its military and administrative capacity in this area to apply it effectively is really one that has to start with something very fundamental and very basic. I have no problem with the policy prescriptions. I have a huge problem with issues of implementation.